All right, let's turn our focus to this now as the war rages on between Israel and Iran, and that continues. The closure of Iranian airspace due to rising tensions between Iran and Israel is causing major disruptions to Indian airlines flying to Europe. Officials said this on Sunday. IndiGo flights to Tbilisi in Georgia and Baku in Azerbaijan now have to make a technical stop for refueling in Doha as well as Qatar. We've now roped in aviation expert Guy Leitch just to unpack all of these developments for us. Guy, very good afternoon to you. So when you consider that the Middle East is really home to a number of international airlines, I mean, just give us a sense of just how much havoc the conflict between Israel and Iran is having on the airspace. We've heard, of course, of hundreds of passengers stranded and of airports in some parts of the Middle East also having to shut down.
Well, absolutely, and good afternoon, and nice to be with you and your viewers. Well, yeah, I mean, as you rightly pointed out, the Middle East is, in fact, the key hub for the world. We've got the three Middle East airlines, obviously, Etihad, Emirates, and Qatar. And the entire airspace to the northwest of them is now effectively closed, which creates enormous problems. And as per your introduction, we've seen, flights out of India heading northwest to Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and so on, also being affected by this airspace closure. And let's be frank about this. This is effectively all-out war between Israel and Iran. There's a footage on social media, on YouTube, I think, taken from an Emirates flight of literally a curtain of rockets being launched from Iran. So you can imagine that any aircraft transiting that airspace would be impossibly vulnerable. It reminds me of, would you believe it's now 11 years ago, when the MH1, that's Malaysian Airlines 17 flight, was shot down over western Ukraine, which is not far from Iran, by a Russian rocket. These are the same sort of risks that can't be taken any further. Then the insurance company certainly would not stand for it. So hence we're seeing flights cancelled on a wholesale level and other flights having to take much further routes around the affected area.
And what does that entail? I mean, and what does it mean, particularly from a financial standpoint for airlines, when they have to then have these route recalculations and also having to make layovers at certain points where they ordinarily wouldn't?
Well, of course, it's enormously expensive, particularly because the airlines these are short-haul routes or short-range routes. So it's not particularly far to Azerbaijan, for instance. It's about 4,000 kilometers, which is not far for most airlines, but they're using short-haul aircraft for these. So that's why they've got to refuel in places like Doha. And the moment you're going to do that, you've got all the approach fees, the landing fees, you've got the additional fuel upload, and it costs an enormous amount to get fuel to altitude because you've got this massive load of fuel that you've got to carry to now 38,000 feet, which uses an enormous amount of energy in its own right. There is a rule of thumb that on a flight like, for instance, from Johannesburg to London, it cost you 4 tons to carry 10 tons of fuel. In other words, there was 40% consumption of fuel just to get the fuel, to carry the extra fuel. So the running costs are much increased. And then, of course, as you've pointed out, there are the accommodation costs for cancelled flights and so on. So this has been an enormous setback for airlines in the Middle East and in particular India. And of course, the last thing India needs after the Air India crash is yet more setbacks like this, which make air travel less attractive.
And I mean, we don't know at this stage in terms of when we're likely to see an end in sight, particularly as we speak about the Middle East. But just given that there is just so much geopolitical conflict in most parts of the world, or at least some parts of the world, and considering just how risk-averse airlines are, especially in times of conflict, what strategies do airlines or even airport management companies apply here, to ensure particularly safety, at least in the civil airline industry?
Well, the old saying, or hoary aphorism, if you like, is that safety is a non-negotiable. And by and large, that's true, or safety is our number one priority, is a slightly better phrase. So the fact of the matter is, at the moment, there's doubt. There is no doubt. The airlines just stay on the ground, or else they bypass the area entirely. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, it reminds one back, takes one back to 24 years to 9/11. Do you remember all the airliners parked on the ground in places like Newfoundland, Canada, where they were simply told to return back to where they started from or to the nearest airport and land to just clear the skies? These are the sort of risks that are completely unacceptable to airline travel, because airline travel is so incredibly safe. It's far safer than any other mode of travel by a multiple of as much as 10. It's more dangerous to drive to the airport by a function of 100 than it is to catch a flight. And that's the safety record has been achieved on the back of this non-negotiable approach to safety. There are as many as 100,000 flights a day. So when one single flight meets a tragic end, as we saw with this Air India Boeing 787 crash, it makes an enormous amount of news, just because airlines cannot afford to be seen to be taking any chances, especially after the MH17 shootdown in this area. It would just be absolutely unforgivable if another airliner full of hundreds of passengers and crew was to be shot down because it ventured too close to all the massive number of rockets that have been fired from Iran and presumably back from Israel as well.
Thank you so much for unpacking all of that for us. We really do appreciate it. Aviation expert Guy Leitch there for us, of course, as we continue to monitor the situation in Israel and Iran.